Good afternoon. What I want to talk about today is something that's been on my mind for 4 or 5 years, right? And an interest and a curiosity in watching this thing unfold. So we can go back to 2019, 2020, we know all that happened there, right? My interest in that, for here anyway, is the effect that those things have had on people, right? So one of the most common things that I see from like making videos and seeing comments and stuff is people's frustration or disbelief or annoyance with the fact that they try and talk to people about certain topics, and the level of apathy that they get back, it causes people to become confused, right, or even angry at it. So, and rightly or wrongly so, right? It's a response that people have to indifference to certain serious topics that surely need to be discussed by all the adults in the room, right? And it's so widespread and common that it kind of needs to be addressed, I think. So there's apathy is a big part in, along with a few other behavioral things that you're seeing in people, and they can be categorized nicely under. I'm going to take a psychiatric term here, even though I'm not that interested in them, right? Because they can lose meaning, right? Because they're just there to designate a set of behaviors, right? Don't really tell you much in and of themselves, right? But PTSD would be one that really seems to capture what it is you're seeing in people, right? So what I'm going to do here is read from two different books. They're two different authors. They are both psychotherapists, right? And not only are they psychotherapists, they are somatic therapists, right? So they deal largely with the relationship between oneself and one's body. But they don't really make that distinction. They see it as, from the ground up, you are all of those things, right? It's not just my mind and my body. They're the same thing, right? Or they are part of one whole. They're just two aspects of the same thing, which is you, right? So I'm going to read from Peter Levine, The Unspoken Voice, and Alexander Lown's book on narcissism, right? And we'll see if we can kind of throw a ring around and capture what it is that we're seeing in people. So the first one is from Peter Levine, and he's talking about the history of what led up to the category or the label of PTSD, right? So, quote, "Finally, the current terminology, derived largely from the experiences of the Vietnam War, is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. As PTSD, the universal phenomenon of terror and paralysis, in which the nervous system has been strained to the breaking point, leaving body, psyche, and soul shattered, is now fully sanitized as a medical disorder. With its own convenient acronym and serving the dispassionate nature of science, the archetypal response to carnage has now been artificially severed from its ravaging origins. Where it was once aptly conveyed by the terms fright paralysis and shell shock, it is now simply a disorder." Yeah. So what he's talking about there is the hijacking or the stealing of what is a biological response to fear and atrocities and horrible things. Natural response to baby cries when people are fighting around it, that sort of a thing, when they're scared, right? He's talking about the stealing or the kidnapping of that from an instinctual biological level into the conceptual level, right? Where you're just thinking of it now as a category instead of as a violent or assertive physiological reaction to something that is going wrong in your environment that poses a danger to you, right? So that's interesting. He also speaks here of people being traumatized or traumatized people, and he breaks it up a little bit, so you'll read on. Quote, "Highly traumatized and chronically neglected or abused individuals are dominated by the immobilization shutdown system." Freeze, right? On the other hand, acutely traumatized people, often by a single recent event and without a history of repeated trauma, neglect, or abuse, are generally dominated by the sympathetic fight-flight system. They tend to suffer from flashbacks and racing hearts, while the chronically traumatized individuals generally show no change or even a decrease in heart rate. These sufferers tend to be plagued with dissociative symptoms, including frequent spaciness, unreality, depersonalization, and various somatic and health complaints. Somatic symptoms include gastrointestinal problems, migraines, some forms of asthma, persistent pain, chronic fatigue, and general disengagement from life. Okay, so apathy, a disinterest in what is going on around you. And he makes the distinction there between those who have, maybe it was one instance that rattled them, right? So something you can picture, it was at this moment that things changed, right? So veering off a road and hitting a tree, that stays with you, okay? Those sort of things stay with you because they're an instant. There's also the slow erosion of self-esteem, which comes from prolonged exposure to hostile, aggressive, controlling, manipulative behavior, right? Or persistent neglect, not getting your needs met, right? Struggling. And there's been experiments done on this with dogs, and you can see it in people as well. People who allow themselves to remain in horrendous relationships, and it just seems to break them. At some point, they no longer are that person that they were before. They go through the motions of day to day, right? But if you were to ask them to pinpoint at what time this happened, they might not be able to, because it's a sustained barrage that just weighs down people and eventually buries them alive, right? So what I'm talking about here is, or the connection I would like to make here, is between the response to the COVID, or the COVID response, and people's minds, right? So it wasn't just a quick shock, a bomb went off, now go deal with it. It was slow, incremental, increasing in intensity, coming back to a semblance of normality, and then increasing again, right? And what happens there when the person can't predict the level of tension or aggression, if they can't predict the pattern in it, then they can't find within that pattern a place to be calm and a place to gather themselves again. So they're constantly on edge, right? They're constantly on edge. Again, go back to abusive relationships. If your partner drinks and becomes violent, some days they're fine, other days they're not, right? It's that unknowing, the inability to predict what is going to be coming next, that plummets people into a sense of learned helplessness, right? Where you feel like you've so little control over what comes next that you eventually just give into it and give up on yourself. Okay, and I believe that that's what we're looking at. I'll repeat it again. So he speaks of somatic symptoms including gastrointestinal problems, migraines, some forms of asthma, persistent pain, chronic fatigue, and general disengagement from life. And what's interesting about that is we see the conversation of excess deaths, younger people dying, and it's been linked to what was the answer to the pandemic, right? And that might be so, and it would be foolish to deny that outrightly. And while I'm not trying to create an either or here, I'm just simply trying to add another layer to what might already be something that is killing people or hurting people. And that is the level of stress that people found themselves under, sustained for a number of years, really. Unparalleled in previous generations, right? And in terms of humankind as a whole, because it was nearly a worldwide thing, right? So what happens to the person when they're constantly under stress, right? Their body begins to wear and break down. So people get sick, their organs fail, things like that, right? So that's interesting. And he's going to speak, and last one from him then is, no, actually, I'll go to Alexander Lowndes' definition of a narcissist, right? So he speaks of the narcissist as not fully being in love with themselves. It's not I love myself, aren't I great? That seems to be the kind of common or garden take on narcissism. He tweaks it a little bit, and he's saying that it's not necessarily an adoration of the self, it's an adoration of the image of who they are, right? And you can see this would be exacerbated in environments or situations where the person's social evaluation, how they're evaluated socially, so their social place on the ladder is primary, right? And over the last couple of decades, you've seen this being promoted and elevated to probably the top priority in the world, right? With social media and stuff, where it's all about, or a good chunk of it is about, how you're seen to other people, right? You know, the whole idea, like, so people getting these lovely posing pictures on front of the Leaning Tower of Pisa or whatever. You understand me? And then it's rare to find someone that takes a photo of themselves just as they're after waking up, right? You see the lovely side of it. That's the image of the person that they're trying to project out into the world. This is the version of myself I want to be judged according to, right? And if you're getting a load of positive reinforcement from people around you, which is lovely, and we're all like that, and we all like to be liked and all that sort of stuff, right? Degrees. Then you can become overly attached to that image, even though it's not necessarily grounded in reality. There's a snippet of truth connecting yourself and the ideal image of yourself that you're trying to sell. But the ideal image is a snippet, right? It's not you consistently. It's not who you are day to day, 24 hours of the day, right? So people can become enthralled with that. The narcissism myth, he fell in love with his own image, right? To the detriment of everything else around him. In the myth, to the detriment of love, right? So there's a fascination that goes on with how you are perceived by other people. And what Lewin is talking about here is the goings on intrapsychically of the person that would be deemed a narcissist, right? So he says, simply put, I equate the self with the living body, which includes the mind. The sense of self depends on the perception of what goes on in the living body. Perception is a function of the mind and creates images. So what's interesting about that is it's common sense. It's so close to us that we don't see it sometimes. So how do you feel in your body? How does your body feel to you? How does it respond to you? Is it strong? Is it as strong as you would like? Is it as able to sustain a pace of running or whatever that it's like? Do you have rhythm that you appreciate? That sort of a thing. How do you feel in and of yourself? Not what your image of yourself is, but what's your body telling you about yourself? Are you a little short of breath when you get up the stairs? How do you feel about that? What does that say about you? Okay, that sort of a thing. A constant conversation between the reality of you, which is what your body can do, and the image of what you would like to be seen as, or what you would like people to think you can do, right? So he goes on. Narcissists don't deny that they have bodies. Their grasp of reality is not that weak, but they see the body as an instrument of the mind, subject to their will. So my body is killing me today, that sort of thing, instead of I am in pain, right? There's a severing of the connection between me, myself, and my body, this thing that I have and own and operate, right? There's a disconnection there. He continues, clearly, in my opinion, the basic disturbance then in the narcissistic personality is the denial of feeling. Okay, so the denial of feeling, so the denial of bodily instincts, they are repressed. People's attention is not, a lot of people's attention is not focused on what's going on internally, physiologically. What's your body preparing for? Is it in a state of ready to go? Is it in a state of shutting down and wanting to shy away from things? Okay. And Levine then speaks about trauma and the body and mind, right? So this is a bit of a long one, but hopefully it paints a picture for you. So under ordinary circumstances, physical sensations are signals for action. They tell you something about what's going on around you, right? Your body reacts to the environment you're in. And we can kind of confabulate or create any sort of rationalization for what's going on, but a lot of the time we can float away from the reality of it, right? So I feel unsettled in this person's company, but I also don't like confrontation. I don't like pointing things out, so I nearly convince myself that this person, it couldn't be them, right? That sort of a thing. We can lie to ourselves, essentially. So he's saying, under ordinary circumstances, physical sensations are signals for action. To fight or flee when threatened, to chase down a wild turkey, or open the fridge and make a sandwich when hungry, to go to the bathroom when the urge presses, to make love when aroused by passion, to sleep when tired, to break into song when the mood strikes, or to plant your feet and raise your voice in anger and assertiveness when your boundaries are violated. In all these instances, the body initiates and the mind follows. Okay, so he's looking at it from a bottom up, ground up. Our physical response to the environment feeds into what our thinking becomes, right? Our thinking is based on, or our feeling is based on our interaction with the environment, and our thinking falls out of that then, or grows from that. He continues, having an intimate relationship with and understanding of your physical sensations is critical, because they, in signaling action, guide you through the experiences and nuances of your life. If one has been traumatized, however, one's sensations can become signals not for effective action, but rather for fearful paralysis, helplessness, or misdirected rage. When some of one's bodily signals become harbingers of fear, helplessness, impotent rage, and defeat, he or she is typically avoided like the plague, at a dear cost, mentally, emotionally, and physically. While attempting to shut down distressing sensations, one pays the price of losing the capacity to appreciate the subtle physical shifts that denote comfort, satisfaction, or warning of clear and present danger. Sadly, as a result, the capacity for feeling pleasure, garnering relevant meaning, and accessing self-protective reflexes also shuts down. You can have it both ways. When feelings of dread are held at bay, so are the feelings of joy. Right, so what are we talking about there? We are talking about the idea of people becoming so rattled and scared that their nervous system is essentially after collapsing in on itself. It's gone into self-preservation mode, which means in the wild you'd see this as play dead. You see cheetah when they hunt gazelles or whatever it is, if they get one, the gazelle, if it cannot get away, if it's been taken down, it plays dead. And you see sometimes the cheetah might lose a bit of interest in it, or believe it to be dead, so it'll wander a little bit away from it, giving the gazelle time to go, right? Fly. Or run, not fly, to get my point. So I believe that people are in this frozen part, right? Experiences after crushing their desire to fight back, or their desire to try and get away. They've collapsed in on themselves, and they're no longer functioning as an organism or a person or an animal or a creature that has any real interest in asserting itself against anything. Okay? And you can see this in people, I'm not diagnosing people, that's not what I'm doing, we're just talking about it. You can see this in people's responses too, to go full circle, being told of dangerous information or the potential of danger coming down the line, right? And what will happen to a person if they are what we just described and what I just quoted from these guys, right? If they are in that sort of a state, any information that is shared with them or that they take in that is deemed to be a little bit scary or unsettling will trigger that collapse in them again. So the more information that they see that has danger attached to it, perceived or otherwise, it will cause them to collapse in on themselves again and cause them to freeze, maybe not even further, but freeze all over again, right? Great. So what do we do with these people, right? I don't know, because as much as the whole COVID thing and the lockdowns and all that was an anomalous thing, right? A black swan event and such a unique thing, so too is going to be the response to that, right? And I think ultimately, if you're trying to recover hearts and souls and reignite people's spirits again, number one is simple understanding, right? But which is difficult, right? Because if you have someone that's been through something rotten, right? So someone was killed in front of them, someone has been abused all their life and they're shook, right? Or they were in a car crash, or a loved one died unexpectedly. Horrible things, right? Things that shudder us to the core, right? There's a want in people to overcome the limitations or the stuckness that we can have, the freezing, right? There's a desire for life in all of us that wants to come out of that and rejuvenate ourselves, which leads to a desire to talk about what happened, right? And that can help people make sense of things, right? So to put a bit of structure to your thoughts, and as you hear yourself speak, to engage with how you feel as you hear your words come out of your mouth, right? To draw that connection between your mind the whole way down to your gut and your bowels, right? Your core, that sort of a thing. Am I in alignment here, right? Does this make sense to me? Is what I'm saying, feeling, and physically sensing, are they all in a line? Do they make sense? Are they coherent together, right? The difficulty with that in this instance is that a lot of people allowed themselves to be deceived and confused during COVID, right? So people had their whole lives turned upside down and taken away from them, essentially, in all but breathing, right? Their day-to-day life, their social life, their professional life, all that stuff was snatched away, and they were banned from going where they wanted. We know the whole thing, right? So people's choice was taken away. And it's interesting because Levine speaks of the person who mounts a bit of a fight back if they're being attacked. They tend to suffer a little bit less than the person who freezes, right? Because they feel like they tried, they've done something to try and protect themselves. Whereas the person that freezes is left with the haunting question of, why didn't I do anything? And you hear this from people who've been through things, right? How did I not do anything to stop that? How did I not see that coming? That sort of a thing, right? People are shook. They're left in a total state of confusion, right? So during the COVID thing, we had all these horrible things done to us, right? But instead of pointing the finger at the people who were doing those things to us, a lot of us allowed ourselves to be confused into thinking that what happened and what was done to us was because of a virus. It wasn't bacteria that decided to arrest people who were walking too far from their home. That's not what happened. That's not the reality. The reality was that people in power abused that power to dictate your whole entire life. And in the process, probably shattered a lot of minds and hearts along the way. That people who have died along the way, but people that probably might never recover again from what happened, right? So the desire to straighten yourself out and to heal yourself is now a little bit derailed, because in order for a person to start moving towards that, to come out of that frozen space, right, they also are confronted with the fact that they bought a lie along the way, right? They bought a lie along the way. So they were involved in terrorizing themselves and doing those things to themselves because they allowed themselves to be confused that it was a bug that done this to them and it wasn't other people, right? So there's another layer of defense that people will have to come to, and that is the hardest thing to get people to face, right? Horse the water, the horse could stare at the water all day, right? And that's what people do when they meet that wall of, what was your part to play in it? What level of responsibility are you willing to assume in allowing whatever it was to happen to you, or not fighting back against it, of doing nothing, right? That's what people are confronted with. In order to get past the idea of having these horrible things done to you, people need to understand what their part to play in allowing those things to happen was or were, right? Because you build strength from that. You recognize your frailty and your weakness. I didn't do anything because I was absolutely terrified. Great. Great. Now that you understand that feeling, and what processes were involved prior to that feeling, or that created that feeling, right? Now what do you do going forward? Because if you continue on and you get met with the next event, similar magnitude and similar response, and the same thing happens to you, then you haven't learned anything, right? And you will crumble apart all over again. So, but when we're working with people and you might meet them in your personal life, even people who'd fall into that realm, right, of being frozen and stuck and terrified and scared and indifferent and apathetic to what's going on around them. The best way out of that is action, right? So if you're so frozen because you're so scared, number one is to understand where you are, is to recognize the state you're in. And that comes from connecting with your body, right? And what I mean by that is, can you sit for 5 minutes with no phone, no book, no music, none of that stuff, and just pay attention to what's going on in your body? It sounds easy, right? 5 minutes, 3 minutes. Sit there, eyes open. I've an itch there. That muscle feels a bit tense. My heart rate is slow, and that sort of stuff. How fast am I breathing? That kind of thing. That's the first thing, is to connect with where you are physically. And the second thing then is to see how, right, so if you're in a state of fear, there's things you're looking at. There's things that you could do to try and combat that fear or overcome that fear. And there's things that you definitely don't want to do to try to throw fuel on the fire in any way, right? It's to understand, okay, I'm scared or whatever it is. And then also give yourself a little bit of a plan, a bit of action. What can I do differently? What can I do to make myself not feel as weak and fearful as I am, right? But we are dealing with Irish people at the end of the day who have an immeasurable ability to carry horrors with them and to soldier on and to never address anything and to see that as a virtue, because it is in ways, right? The ability to go along and get on with things. But when you're looking at a blatant disconnection from reality, where people they don't even have the ability to entertain a conversation that could be one that leads to them taking actions that will save them in some way, right? When they can't even address a potential risk in their environment anymore, because the idea of entertaining anything that could be dangerous to them is so overwhelming that they shut down physiologically and mentally, right? When you're dealing with that sort of a depletion of self-esteem in a whole nation, right? There's probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people walking around this country rattled and shook still, right? And not knowing what happened, and their mind is a fog, and they've no interest in anything, and they're just trudging through day to day, right? So I just said I'd throw that out there anyway, because it's a disgusting topic, but it's an interesting one nonetheless, and it needs to be made sense of individually, and it needs people to come together and make sense of it as well. Because as I said a few minutes ago, if you repeat the same process, if something like this happens again in the future, then you haven't learned anything, right?